Chapter 13. Court and Gold. Courts learn manners the way stubborn dogs learn gaits, by being shown where to stand and what happens when they don't. Serene of the East taught the Eastern Court to respect itself in an afternoon. It began with a lordling, whose lineage was older than his judgment. In a corridor designed to make men forget the names of servants, he put a hand on a girl's wrist, because he had never been taught where his hands did not belong. Serene was passing, which is to say fate arranged itself into a lesson. "Release," she said not loudly. He turned a smile on her that had gotten him his way since he learned to button his own cuffs. "Your Highness." The girl was suddenly free. The lordling folded around his new education and made the small wounded sound men make when the world reshelved itself without asking. The fist was not royal. It was the neat declarative punch of a knight. It landed exactly where the body kept its breath and claimed it. The lordling's eyes widened as if he had been struck by a thing he had not expected to find in a palace: consequence. "Let the record show," Serene told the stone, the guards, the courtiers pretending not to watch, and the small god of corridors, that in this palace we all have wrists and none of them are something to be grabbed. She nodded to the girl. "Come," she said, and they walked away without looking back, leaving the lordling trying to breathe around the new painful reality of his brand new understanding. Respect is contagious. By supper, the news had reached the kitchens with the expediency of a good story. By next morning, the court had learned that hands belong to their owners, and that consequences for disrespect of that fact arrive with bruises. The king saw it all with a quiet desire to learn to know her and then, perhaps, find a way to be useful as a father to this confident grown woman. Both came sooner than expected. The assassin came on the third night. He was good. Not palace-trained, but forest-bred, the kind who knows how to move through a room like smoke and leave before anyone remembers to breathe. He picked the lock on Serene's door with the patience of a man who has done such things before and expects to do them again. He crossed the threshold without disturbing the air. His blade was the thin kind, meant for ribs, not ceremony. He did not see the lance leaning in the corner until it was too late to matter. Serene woke the way knights wake, completely, without the luxury of confusion. She saw the shape, saw the blade, and rolled off the bed and into a fighting stance as the knife came down into the empty bed. Her hand found the lance, not the sharp end, the blunt, and she used it like a staff. Low sweep to the ankles, because standing men are harder to reason with than kneeling ones. He went down with a grunt. He was breathing hard, eyes calculating the distance between himself and the door, between himself and her, between himself and a chance at living through the mistake he'd made by underestimating a girl in silk. Desperation was not a good advisor. He launched at her, hoping to complete his task and flee. It was his very last choice and Riffer's first kill. It was his own dagger turned against him in a practiced, almost automatic motion that ended it. The door burst open. Guards poured in with the efficiency of men who have been trained to save princesses, and then froze with the confusion of men who had found the princess staring down at a dead assassin. "Your Highness!" "He came in through the lock," Serene said, not looking away from the pile of flesh that was a man moments ago. "Check the corridor, see if he left friends." They hesitated. She was a princess. The geometry of the situation did not include her standing above a dead man giving orders. "Now," she added, and her voice had the weight Alaris had given it when he'd taught her that command is not volume, it's certainty. They went and caught another man lurking in the shadows. By morning the king had the names. By midday 3 lords had discovered that treason in silk is still treason, and that the crown's patience has limits. By evening, the court had learned that the new princess was not a decoration, and that underestimating her was the kind of mistake you made once if you were lucky, and not at all if you were wise. The king watched as the would-be assassin was carried out of her chambers with his own dagger lodged in his throat. So did the court. It added that sliver of fear into the court's respect that made it a good shield. He had come to her room after the guards left, not as a king but as a father, learning the shape of fatherhood too late. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands steady in her lap, but her shoulders held the rigid stillness of someone who has just discovered what their body is capable of when pressed. The lance leaned against the wall. Blood, not hers, made a small puddle on the floor where the man had fallen and a constellation on her white nightgown. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and hated the inadequacy of the question. "No." Her voice was flat, controlled, the kind of control that costs. He sat, not on the bed but on the chair across from her, giving her space the way one gives a spooked horse room to breathe. "You're first," he said. Not a question. He'd seen enough men after their first kill to recognize the particular shade of shock that comes with it. She nodded once, sharp, as if the motion could cut away what she was feeling. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." Then, after a breath that stuttered, "He was just doing a job. Someone paid him. He had—" Her hands curled into fists. He had calluses, working hands. He wasn't court-bred, just a man who needed coin badly enough to take a contract on a princess he'd never met. The king heard what she didn't say, that it would have been easier if the assassin had been a monster instead of just desperate. "You gave him a chance," he asked quietly. "I did. He didn't take it." Her jaw tightened. Pride or fear, or orders that said he'd die either way if he failed. I don't know which. Does it matter? It should. She looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. I've practiced, drilled, sparred with men who taught me where to hit, how hard, when to stop, but they never— Her voice cracked just slightly. "They never told me what it feels like after." He wanted to lie, to tell her it would get easier, that the weight would lift, that one day she'd forget the sound a man makes when he realizes he's dying. But she was his daughter, raised with a dragon, and trained by knights who valued truth over comfort. She deserved better than platitudes. "It doesn't get easier," he said. "You learn to carry it. That's all. The good ones, the ones who should be carrying swords, they never forget. They count. They remember names when they can. They make the weight mean something by being better men for having borne it." She looked up at him then, eyes raw but steady. "Did you? Count?" "Yes." He showed her his hands as if she could see the tally written there. 12 men by my own hand, 3 in battle, 9 in situations like yours, close, desperate, no room for mercy to be anything but a luxury I couldn't afford." He paused. "I remember all of them. Not their names, most didn't give them. But their faces, the way they fell, what they said if they said anything." "What did they say?" "Mostly nothing useful. Curses, prayers. One man asked me to tell his wife he'd tried." He met her eyes. "I did. Sent her coin too. It didn't make it nicer, but it made her children eat." Seren's breath came easier, as if his honesty had given her permission to stop pretending she was fine. I keep seeing his eyes, the moment he realized I wasn't going to miss, that I was actually going to— She stopped, swallowed. He looked surprised, as if a girl in silk shouldn't know how to kill. "He was a fool then." The king's voice held no comfort, only fact. "You're a knight. He saw the dress and missed the weapon. That's on him, not you." "It doesn't feel like it's on him." "No." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands loose between them. "It feels like it's on you. Like you took something that wasn't yours to take. That's the lie your body tells you after. The truth is simpler. He came to kill you. You stopped him. The world is one murderer lighter and one daughter heavier. I'll take that trade every time." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the bloodstain as if it held answers. Then, quietly, she asked, "Does it make me less of a knight, that I wish he'd just stayed down?" "No." He said it with the certainty of a man who'd asked himself the same question. It makes you human. The ones who don't wish it, who kill easy and sleep sound after, those are the ones you don't want holding swords near people you love. She nodded, slow, as if testing the weight of his words and finding them bearable. Alaris said something like that once. That mercy isn't weakness, but you can't afford it when the person across from you has already chosen violence. Alaris is a wise man, he paused. Did he also tell you that choosing violence and living with the choice are two different skills? No. Well, he stood, moving carefully as if sudden motion might shatter the fragile honesty between them. They are. You've learned the first tonight. The second takes longer. Years, sometimes. And it helps to have people who've walked that road before. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd entered, her face softened just slightly. Are you offering? I'm your father. He said it simply, without weight or plea. I failed you for 19 years. I won't fail you in this. If you need to talk about this or the next one or the weight of carrying any of it, I'm here. Seren stood unsteady for just a breath, and then found her feet the way knights do, by deciding to. Thank you, she said, and the words were small but truly meant. He wanted to embrace her, to hold her the way fathers hold daughters after nightmares, but she was still holding herself like glass, and he knew better than to push. So instead he nodded once and moved toward the door. Father, she said, and he stopped. The man, the one whose wife you sent coin to. Did it help? You, I mean. Did it help you carry it? He thought about lying, about giving her hope that the weight could be managed with small kindnesses and apologies to widows. But she'd asked for the truth. No, he said, but I did it anyway, because some debts aren't about feeling better. They're about being settled. She absorbed that, nodded. I understand. He believed her. The door closed softly behind him. In the room, Riff sat back down on the bed and let herself shake just a little now that she was alone. She made herself a promise she would remember. She would count. She would carry it, and she would not let it make her less than she was. By morning, the maids had scrubbed the floor. By midday, Seren stood in a corridor and taught another lordling that his hands did not, in fact, belong under a crying maid's skirt, and when she struck him, not a polite court slap, but a punch that collected its cost in teeth and bleeding knuckles, her hand did not shake. By evening, the court had learned that underestimating the princess was fatal. The wrong angles of the palace straightened a little, like a piece of bent metal on a smith's anvil, struck exactly right. Some people in court started counting the days until this iron-fisted princess would be leaving, going south to marry their prince, the nicer ones amongst them with a pity for the poor man. Riff was counting them too with careful reverence and a little fear. The court would have been scandalized to know that the prince she was to marry was not a stranger to her. She wondered often how Marius would react to her returning like this, as Princess Serene of the East. Would he be angry, disappointed, glad? She did not know, and sometimes she suspected it was pure cowardice fortified in excuses that had led to the decision to not tell him, to wait until it was impossible to hide and too late for him to run. Part of her even wished he would run himself, thinking he would need to marry a stranger and come looking for her here. She knew this to be folly, for both of them took their duties too seriously. They would meet again under the watchful eyes of oaths older than living memory, and not before, and she would find out what he felt about it then. Rayna watched the tide turn with quiet satisfaction, but without involvement. Riff had always preferred to keep her fights to herself. She did not mind. She had other lessons to teach. In the old Falcon Mews, doors opening outward the way promises should, she stood where light fell honest and turned a handful of frightened men and one frightened beast into a choir with a conductor. The beast was Severin, who no longer mistook obedience for humiliation and had learned that the collar at his throat was a protection he had chosen himself. The men were watch captains and stewards and two women who had long ago learned to clean up after other people's bad plans. They had come prepared. Heavy chains lay coiled in corners like sleeping serpents, their links thick enough to hold a bull. Nets of woven steel hung from pegs, weighted at the edges with lead. A barrel of water stood ready, not for drinking but for dousing fire if fire came. The guards wore leather thick enough to turn claws and stood with the wary alertness of men who have been told what might happen and have chosen to stay anyway. "We begin small," Rayner said to the room. To Severin, gentler. Just the eyes. Just enough to remember what it feels like. He nodded, swallowed, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, following the pattern she'd taught him. Count of 4 in, hold for 7, 8 out. The room held its breath with him. When he opened his eyes again, they were black. Not the black of human pupils gone wide, but the glossed obsidian of a creature that sees heat and motion before it sees colour. One of the guards made a small sound. Severin's head snapped toward the noise, too fast, predator quick. "Name it," Rayner said, voice steady. "What is it?" "Fear," Severin managed, and his voice was rougher, caught between throat and chest. "His fear." "Good. Now, let it go." He blinked again. The black receded like a tide pulled by a moon that had changed its mind. When his eyes were his own again, he sagged against the wall, breathing hard. "Good," Rayner said and meant it. "Tomorrow we will add teeth." The teeth were worse. Teeth wanted to bite. The second day Severin called them forth, just the canines, elongated and sharp, and immediately bit the inside of his own cheek. Blood filled his mouth with the taste of copper and panic. The beast surged, sensing injury, wanting to fix it the only way it knew how, by becoming whole, by armouring the soft human flesh in scales. "Chains!" Rayner barked. The guards moved with practiced efficiency. 2 lengths of chain crossed his chest, pinning him to the stone pillar at the centre of the mews. He fought, not them but himself, muscles seizing with the effort of not changing. Heat rose in his throat. Smoke curled from his nostrils. "I'll get the princess," one of the women called, already running. Rifa arrived as she always did when summoned. She knelt in front of Severin without hesitation, put her hands on either side of his face and met his eyes, still half black, still struggling. "Severin," she said, not loudly. "Ground." He focused on her, on the word, on the thing he had named her in the winter cabin when words were new and terrifying. The chains bit into his shoulders, the smoke in his throat wanted out. But Rifa's hands were cool and steady, and she did not flinch. "Ground," she said again. "You are here. You are held. The beast does not need to save you. You are already safe." She could have pushed the beast back, but chose to offer only a promise of it for now, for to learn to do it himself was the true goal. It took minutes. Long, ugly minutes, where sweat ran down his temples and his breathing came in gasps. But slowly, so slowly the watchers weren't sure when it began, the heat subsided. The smoke thinned, the teeth shortened to human proportions, leaving his mouth bloody but his own. When the guards unchained him, he slumped forward into Riff's shoulder and shook. "Good," Rayner said quietly. "You called it, you held it, you sent it back. That is the work." By the 3rd week, they had a rhythm. Severin would reach for the shape, just a piece of it, claws on one hand, scales along one arm, wings half formed and folded against his back like an unfinished thought. The guards stood ready, chains in hand, but more often than not, they stayed coiled. Rife attended every session, sitting cross-legged near enough to intervene, far enough not to crowd. He learned to hold the change at the edge, to sit with his hands scaled and clawed and not let it spread, to feel the heat building in his chest and bank it, like coals kept ready, but not fed. "Why does it want to be whole?" he asked one afternoon, staring at his half-transformed arm with something between fascination and disgust. "Because it doesn't understand half measures," Rayner said. "It knows beast and it knows man. But the space between confuses it. You're teaching it that the in-between can be deliberate, that it doesn't have to choose one or the other. It can choose both, but on your terms. What if I can't? Then we chain you until you can, Riff said, matter of fact. And I sit with you until the beast remembers it's not alone in there. He looked at her then, really looked, and found no pity in her face, only the steady certainty of someone who had once held him while he changed against his will and had decided he was worth the trouble of teaching. Again, he said, distracting himself from the strange thoughts and feelings that she seemed to stir up in him of late. The breakthrough came on a cold morning, when frost made the stones slick and the guard's breath plumed in the air. Severin stood in the centre of the mews, chains ready but not yet fastened. Raina had asked him to try something new, the full transformation, but controlled. Not the drowning, thrashing panic of the beast taking him, but a deliberate step from one shape to another. "You'll lose your words," she warned. "The beast doesn't use them, but you won't lose your mind. Not if you hold the thread." "What thread?" "Me," Riff said, standing. She walked to him, took his hand, the human one, and pressed it against the silver collar at his throat. "And this? You go, but you come back. We'll make sure of it. The ground will catch you if the ribbon is not enough." He nodded, breathed, let the change come. It was different this time, slower. He felt each scale slide into place like a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten he owned. Felt his bones lengthen and hollow, making room for flight. Felt a fire kindle in his chest, not wild, but his, banked and ready. When the black dragon stood where the man had been, the guards tensed, but the beast did not roar, did not lash out. It turned its head toward Rife and, carefully, so carefully, lowered its massive skull until the silver collar gleamed in the light. Riff put her hand on the scales above it. "Good," she said. "Now come back." The change reversed, not all at once, but in the same deliberate way it had come. Scales receded, wings folded into memory. The fire dimmed to embers. When Severin stood human again, naked but whole, keeping his clothes would take time and more practice. He looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I didn't forget," he said, wonder in his voice. "I was the beast, but I didn't forget." "No," Raina said, and there was pride in it. "You didn't." After that, the work became easier. Not easy, never easy, but possible. Severin learned to call the beast and dismiss it, to hold it at the surface or let it sink deep, to change in the space of a breath or stretch the transformation over minutes, savouring the strangeness of being two things at once. The chains stayed in the mews, but they gathered dust. The guards relaxed, degree by degree, until they were simply witnesses to a man learning the shape of his own power. He was learning, at last, to be whole. "Again," Raina said, and Severin breathed in the shape of a dragon, and then breathed it out again, slower. "Name it. Let it stand. Ask it to sit." He did. The black came up like a tide called by the moon. It stood in him, no longer the thief of his body, but its comrade. It sat when asked, not out of fear, but because it had been offered dignity and found it to its taste. "Good," Raina said. "Now speak." Grey sitting large to show how. Severin put words down between teeth that had learned fire and found that they fit. "Stay," he told the beast gently, and his shoulders, those treacherous translators of panic, remembered how to be a home, not a barricade. Something in the room changed its mind about him then, about Raina. It happened without ceremony. Dull grey sitting opposite of the black turned to a deep, living metal. Gold not of coin but of harvest, of wheat heads in wind, of bells with good voices. It wasn't shine, it was certainty. The colour came in as if it had always been there and had finally been invited to be counted. She felt it as a click in the hinge where patience lives, not heat, gravity. Eliza had been green because she knew how to nurture and grow. Raina, now gold, discovered that her gift was leadership of the lost. She could put herself where confusion was and cause it, in the gentlest way to find its way out of the door. And exactly that was what she felt she must do with her life. "Gold! Mine!" Severin said, still large wonder in his voice and a little relief, for he had already felt the jealousy-tinged worry for the day he would need to relinquish her to her mate. Raina did not weep. She did touch the silver at his throat and smile to herself when they were both small again. The bond between them, which had been a rumour and then a hypothesis and then a discipline, woke up like a sleeper who had finally had enough of a dream. It was not a chain and not a song. It was breath-finding, breath agreeable that made the ribbon redundant. Eastern Court had no choice but to get used to seeing black and gold in the sky, just as High Pass had grown accustomed to emerald in the evening sun. If it had any opinions about it, it kept them wisely behind its teeth. When their journey to the south was approaching, the old king called for the seamstresses and told them a thing that made them blink. "2," he said. "Pack 2 white dresses." "For the wedding?" the brave one asked. "For 2 weddings," he said. "Make one easy to fit to a bride you have not seen, but is similar to the one you have seen." And then promptly swore them to secrecy. The seamstresses did not tattle, but they did wonder amongst themselves if they might be getting a queen at last. Serene had finally found in him a man she could call father without pretense, and told him about her life as Rif born into the palms of a dragon, raised as a playmate to a prince who needed her to hold his storms, and to a young dragon who needed an almost sister and a full friend. And finally of the woman left to guard the nest, Solara of the Pass, many years removed from the girl in the hayloft, but still alive and in charge of the keep that the dragons of the pass called home. He had asked then, cautiously, if Solara would forgive him. Rife broke through for a moment and told him contemptuously that despite offers she had still not married, so he clearly had a chance. And so the king commissioned a second dress, with hope and a little bit of fear. Letters went south. Some had seals. One had a smear of soot and scattering of burned pinholes that made a constellation if you liked that kind of thing. Anlina read what mattered and ignored what did not. Eliza read everything and pretended she had not. Katarin lifted a cup that smelled of apples and told Marius in the tone that revealed nothing. "Weather holds. Prepare your walls." On the last morning before the Eastern party set its face toward High Pass, Rif took back her lance from where it had been counting seasons in the corner and said, "Enough idle." The wood forgave her. Weapons have generous hearts if you treat them correctly. The procession was small on purpose. Big processions invite folly. The king rode by her side. Above them 2 dragons wheeled. The black moved as if remembering his own instructions and finding them agreeable. He dropped and rose with the efficient joy of a creature that has stopped arguing with itself. The gold flew as if she were flock and wind and captain all at once, making circles that gathered the little caravan inside them, not possessively but with the assurance of someone who can see far and intends to. On the road, the East showed its better manners. Farmers lifted hands and did not make the sign against beasts. Children pointed and did not cry. Wolves, who had learned to keep their opinions to themselves, nodded in correct silence from the tree line. They camped that night where 2 jurisdictions shake hands over a river that never bothers to remember which side it favours. Rif took the first watch because knights take first watch, and for the journey the princess was packed away in travelling trunks. Raina sat with her, gold banked under cloak, and passed her a slice of hard pear that tasted better for not being deserved. Severin settled near the edge of light and kept company with the stars without insulting them by comparison. "South," Rif said quietly, and the word did not bite. "High Pass," Raina echoed. "Anlina will have her ledgers. Mother will have her opinions. Marius will have his boots on. And court will be difficult." Seren, breaking through in the woman that had learned to be both, smiled into the dark. "Good," she said. "Let's teach them how to behave." The East slept better than it had in years, knowing the iron-fisted princess was gone. The South, catching a rumour of the return of someone long missed, opened a window impatiently. In the morning they went on. Chapter 14. The Oath and the Lance. The dragon's nest keeps the best roof in the south for seeing what is coming toward you and whether you are glad of it. Marius stood there with the wind behaving itself out of politeness for his power and the day pretending to be simpler than it was. He had learned, in 2 years, what it meant to wear waiting like a garment that did not chafe if you held your shoulders correctly. Today it chafed anyway. 2 shapes cut themselves out of the distance and made the air remember its job. The first was black, not absence, glossed and whole, the kind of black that has learned to love light because it knows it can hold it. The second was gold, the way bells are gold when rung for weddings and warnings both. They crossed once and again, not a flourish. An agreement. Rhianna came down first because she refuses to let anyone think she needs announcing. Severin spiraled after her and tucked his landing into a neat apology to those who still remembered him as a rumour of ruin. He still wore the silver collar. The green ribbon had gone invisible because the bond it represented had learned to keep its own company. Marius stepped forward. Not prince so much as boy who had waited in a field too long for a cart to appear. He took Rhianna's forearms because dragons prefer honesty to choreography, and bowed to Severin because memory had paid for the right to be explicit. "Rafe?" he asked, and the name did something to the roof he would rather not have had witnesses to. "Will she?" "She will," Rhianna said with a glimmer of mischief evident in her voice. "With her father, for the wedding. She is bringing exactly the trouble a court needs to stay honest." They had agreed to say this, and no more. Cruel, perhaps, but to do otherwise might complicate the ritual. It was not to be known that it was more of a homecoming than a political marriage. There was no place for Rif in this covenant, only for Seren of the East. Marius let his breath go, nodded, wrote hope down where it could not offend anyone, and went back to being a person with duties and a mouth that could make vows without lying. Solara met the king in his assigned room in the magistrate's mansion. When she had been summoned, she did not know why. She presumed something was amiss with the housekeeping, for she was down at the mansion to prepare for the wedding, and the royal accommodation was as always her duty. When the veiled princess at the door briefly lifted her veil and hugged her, she swayed only lightly. Her whisper, "I did not find him worthy of a beating, mother, just a slap," was still ringing in her ears as she stepped in. She did not slap him. That had been Riffa's work, and enough. She said her piece and heard his. And in the silence that followed, he made his plea and she said yes. She had said yes long ago. There was hardly any need to ask again. The man was the same. It did not change much that he now came with a kingdom and a crown. The dress arrived at Solara's door, and quietly, arrangements for a second royal wedding, right after the one covenant demanded, began. Lady Lyanna laughed when Solara told her. She was thinking of the day the slip of a girl from the mountain had sat in formidable company and nursed a dragon. Now she was to have a title of their equal, and she thoroughly approved it. The queen had always lived inside that girl. It was now merely announced to the world. The elders knew, of course, who the Eastern princess was. They kept quiet, each with their own reason. Katarin wanted Marius to taste the bitterness of duty before it turns sweet, and Lena wanted his boy to understand that Riffa's choices are her own. Eliza just laughed in expectation of a good prank, and Alaris has always respected Riffa's wishes even if he disagreed with them. The day came. High Pass had a way of putting on its best stone without being asked. They watched the weather, and Katarin let it be perfect because sometimes kindness is as simple as not proving you can do better. Anlena had the ledgers closed, the accounts paid, the small wars put to sleep long enough for an afternoon. Alaris stood where men who refuse to be ornamental stand, near enough for utility, far enough to make an exit without drama. The officiant was an old woman whose voice could have cut treaties if given a chance. She cared for the right things and did not let the wrong things get a seat. The hall filled with the ordinary miracle of people deciding to behave. Marius stood before the stone and wood dais. He wore dark blue embroidered with patterns that declared both his magic and his royalty, and kept his hands open because power ought to look like an invitation before it must look like a wall. His eyes were restless, looking at the crowd searching for that precious thing he had misplaced long ago and wondering what he would do if he saw her. He did not see her. She was not there. He would never find out if he would choose her over a kingdom. The choice had never been his. It was hers, and her absence was telling him what it was. He accepted it. The music started. The Eastern King entered. On his arm, his veiled bride. Marius tried very hard to look at his fate without picking a fight with it. He looked at the officiant's hands. He looked at Elisa, who had put her shoulders in the posture dragons use when they are trying not to cry or laugh. He looked at Anlena's mouth, which had found the line between amusement and pride, and stood on it like a general on a wall. He looked at the floor, which had nothing to say and said it well. Then he looked at what was to be his future. The bouquet had no business being beautiful. It was a fistful of field flowers made ambitious by occasion, bound tight in white cloth. And all of it had been welded, gently, cleverly, to an old lance shaft, worn smooth where a hand had taught it manners, scarred where learning had been expensive. He knew that wood. His heart forgot its instruction. The world narrowed to a handle and the person who had worn it into the shape of herself. They said her name. Her Highness, Sirene of the East, the steward announced, now accustomed to the new name the court had been given to hold. He heard the name and discarded it like a piece of soiled cloth. It was not what he saw. He saw the way her shoulders rolled once to make the dress remember it was cloth, not policy. He saw the small scar on her hand, gotten from a bar fight that he had once bandaged. He saw that she had chosen to be here and was not sorry. When she stood beside him, she did not bow more than courtesy required. He took her hand because arrangements should be given a proper start, and her palm met his with the old, infuriating, beloved calm that had once pushed him out of the way of his own folly, and then laid on his back to keep him safe until the folly passed. He knew, his storm knew, names did not matter, and the veil hid nothing. Marius suddenly felt light as a feather. The prophecy that had felt like a curse a moment ago was now, coupled with another's made manifest, looking very much like a blessing. The officiant began the old words, the ones that make blood magic purr and bureaucrats preen. Marius did not hear them. He was busy rewriting his own. When it was his turn, he did not try to be clever. Clever belongs to negotiations and stagecraft. Vows should be simple, or they are not true. "I will stand but not cage," he said, voice steady because truth prefers steady. "I will be a good husband to the honor we have chosen, and a better man to the woman who stands here of her own will. I have loved you for a long time, and I will keep loving you until the end of my days." The old magic liked that. It stopped pretending not to listen. Her turn. She could have said the words the court loves. Soft inversions, cleverly gilded duty. She chose the language that made her. "I am your knight," she said, and the hall did not know whether it was allowed to be moved, and therefore was. "I stand between you and harm, you and folly, you and flattery when it would eat you alive. I will tell you no when your friends are tired and your enemies secretly rejoice. I will be your honor when yours falters. I will keep faith with both the realm and the man, but my oath and my loyalty and my love belongs to you. It already belonged to you when I agreed to be your peace." The officiant's mouth almost laughed, and then decided to remain proper. Eliza made the sound dragons make when a sword rings true. Lena, who disapproved of public displays of feeling on principle, allowed her eyes to water just this once. Katarin said good to the air in a tone that would have made a storm settle. The old magic lifted its head, sniffed at the words, decided that contracts carried willingly taste better than those forced down, and purred. In the nest's tower, the bell rang without human hands on the rope as if in confirmation of that intangible approval. They bound hands and drank from one cup because rituals like to be fed. The ring, Old East, Old South, travelled its circle as had many times before. He kissed her knuckles after lifting her veil, not her mouth, and she nodded once in approval in a way that meant later. When the bells finally quieted, the other wedding was announced, and Rife watched her mother, in white dress very similar to hers, accept the crown of the East like she was accepting the morning delivery at the nest, with gracious confidence. Joy in the women who had seen her come into the keep was alive and roaring and only slightly tempered for the formalities. She had waited for so long, and so had he. Something was healed that had little hope becoming so in those first days at the nest. At the feast, someone had the presumption to put the lance with its flowers on the high table as if it were an ornament. Riff, not the princess in white but the knight beneath, reached, took the thing by the haft, and set it against the wall where it could listen to music and not be expected to perform. Later, when witnesses had been thanked and gossip put to bed and prophecies had finished their smug, small dances on the rafters, they stood in the quiet that follows work done correctly. "Wife?" he tried, and she snorted softly at the strangeness, then allowed it because the day had earned a little awkwardness. She remained silent, but her eyes held a warmth. He took her hand again, more sure of it than he had a right to be, and kissed the small white scar near her knuckles where a bottle long ago had tried to teach her a lesson she did not need. "Welcome home," he said. "I would have come anyway," she answered, then asked cautiously, "Was it worth the wait for me to come as your queen, not as your knight without delay?" Marius thought of the 2 years of misery and put them on one side of the scale. And then he tallied the years that were still to come and would not be a pure agony sleeping next to a stranger on the other side. He found himself urgently confirming that yes, it was worth the wait. Epilogue. What was kept? The nest learned new manners. Dragons lived there because roofs should have some ambition. But living again under one's mother's roof was not what young ones could make peace with. Words were exchanged, sharp enough to seek new solutions, and kind enough to leave the doors open and black and gold left to live in the forest of the East, where they built their own nest over their old cabin. As for the South, people still argued about grain and borders, and which bell was older. It is a country, not a miracle. But the arguments wore better coats and showed up sober more often than before when they didn't. Lena's handwriting remained a local weather pattern, clear, unavoidable, followed by relief. Elisa pretended to disapprove of any roof not improved by claws, and in Catarin's set, weather gently for weddings and funerals and the unglamorous days between. Lord Redder and Alaris, who between them had made a knight out of a girl, took upon themselves about a week after the wedding the dangerous errand of advising a crown princess on the matter of showing her husband some affection. They had noticed the way Marius looked at her with smouldering eyes and unmistakable longing when she was not looking, only to feign polite calm when she did. Some lessons, Alaris reflected, might have been learnt too well. "Rife," Lord Redder began gently, "your husband looks at you like a starving man. How long are you going to keep him too polite?" Rifa considered him as she might consider an unfamiliar lance, balance, reach, likely mischief. "I have not kept him. He has minded his manners himself," she said finally with mild annoyance, simmering under the calm of her voice. "Just," Alaris ventured, eyes on the teacup, "perhaps he has not understood that the old rules can go now. Perhaps you need to show him the way. Riff's smile was the kind that has rescued men from ambushes and put them into them when necessary. Perhaps, she said, I will see what can be done. It took merely a day for the mentors to discover the consequences of their own counsel. The morning after the talk, Marius, who had grown soft sitting at councils, presented himself with a sway and stiffness that suggested he had recently discovered a new form of diplomacy that had included a vigorous sparring match. He was both bruised and dazed in equal measure, along with a propensity to get lost in his own recollections with a foolish grin and then snap back to the gathering with a blush. Lord Redder cleared his throat twice to keep the council from inquiring what was not their business. Alaris looked at the ceiling and tried to devise a plan. By afternoon, they had added an item to the prince's daily schedule labelled simply stamina and sent a quiet note to Lady Lyanna, who had a gift for the kind of conversation swords do not cut. Lady Lyanna arrived with the gravity due a matter of state and the fondness due an idiot child. She took Ref for a walk where the wind could be blamed for blushes. She provided instruction on tenderness that had never been part of her education, and afterward took Marius aside long enough to suggest that enthusiasm is not a replacement for pacing, and that ardour should be stored like grain. Plenty for winter, plenty for sowing, and enough left over so that no one dies of their own harvest. The boy, who was not a boy anymore, learned, and life settled to a hum. At High Pass House, where now Southern Court resided for all but most formal occasions, they learned to applaud new kinds of vows. It learned to mind its wrists. It learned to offer chairs. The old covenant, fed properly, settled down like a working dog. Alert, willing, content when given a job that suits. A lance leaned against a wall within easy reach when Seren was speaking, always willing to bring back Rife when needed. It listened to music sometimes, and sometimes, quite abruptly, it accompanied a knight stuffed in a princess dress to the yard to remind men that the world will not always meet them with smiles and ceremony despite appearances. In the East, wrong-angled corridors remembered how to be kind. They had been taught to pay attention by a princess who did not pull a punch, so the arrival of her mother wearing the crown of their queen, just as they thought the storm was over, caused a fear-flavoured stir. Solara's polite firmness seemed almost soft compared to the princess, but it was much more thorough. She did not stop at the offender and went straight after the customs that had led to poor choices. She took the long way through the wrong-angled corridors on purpose and straightened them with a quiet word rather than a punch. Servants learned her stride and respect it demanded before courtiers learned to properly bow to her. She did not rearrange the palace. She rearranged the habits of the people inside it. The king, who had once been a boy hiding in a hayloft, began to walk his palace as if the rooms pleased him back. In the forest, two dragons were building their own destiny with the warm words and watchful eyes of Solara always supporting them. Solara had nursed the gold one once, and for both of them that was as good as a daughter. The dragon leaned on her with gratitude, and the court was wise enough to take notice. One, a gold dragon treated with affection, due a mother, was not someone they could cross if they wanted to keep their roofs. By the next spring, when pear trees were foolish with bloom, the palace carried a new sound down its stone, an infant's serious indignation that the world should be better than it is, and warmer besides. They named the prince for two grandfathers and a river that refuses to decide where it begins, but called him Raif anyway. On the 8th morning, in a small ceremony that made the old magic take an unscheduled nap, Seren, Rif had leaned her lance for the ceremony, hung the heir's locket at the soft fold of his neck. It warmed at once, answering the ring on his father's hand the way good bells answer one another across valleys. Not boasting, merely sure. Kept, she said, and the crest on tin and gold both agreed. What had been searched for had been found. What had been found had learned to keep itself. And what was kept had come home to be what it always meant to be wearing one's true colours.